Hi, this is Jim of Shiloh Hall with a video addressing who the occupants of Qumran might have been according to Rachel Elior. Rachel Elior is a Hebrew or Jewish scholar, and these excerpts are taken from a lecture that she did at the University of Chicago. Um, we are familiar with the fact that it's commonly understood to be a group called the Essenes, but she's going to address who they are in respect to who we think it probably is, which is the sons of Zadok. Just a quick history, and she's going to address it better than I'm going to. But in 175, the last legitimate Zadokite priest was deposed by Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, and replaced by Jason, Onias, his brother. So Onias III was the last Zadokite priest. He was deposed by Antiochus and then replaced by Jason, his brother, who was a Zadokite. He was a Zadokite, but he wasn't a legitimate Zadokite priest. 3 years later, he was deposed by Menelaus, and then a little bit after that, or a little ways after that, uh, Menelaus was deposed or replaced by Achimas, I believe is his name. Neither of whom are neither of whom are Zadokites. And then later, after them, we begin the Maccabeans, the Hasmoneans, begin to sit on that priesthood, starting with Jonathan after Judas, and then I think Simon was after, led the charge after Judas, and then you had Jonathan, and Jonathan sat on the priesthood, which is not legitimate priesthood. So really, from 175 forward, we no longer had the Zadokite priesthood sitting in the priesthood, and instead we had a fraudulent, deposed, nominated priesthood of non-Zadokites, an illegitimate priesthood that had sat in that position from 175 forward. And then after the Zadokites were removed and deposed, my understanding, according to this booklet that I'm reading, is that Onias IV, the son of Onias III, the last Zadokite priest, left and went to Egypt, where he set up a temple of sorts for the Zadokites. But the Yehudim would consider that illegitimate because that's just not. That's not a temple in Jerusalem. So ultimately, the sons of Zadok, and this is the point that I even bring all of this up and that I'm portraying this. Ideally, the argument would be, the thesis would be, and that's being proposed, is that the deposed Zadokite priesthood ended up migrating over to what would be called today Qumran or Bethabara, according to the King James and some of the others. Bethabara, I believe, is what it's called. But they would have migrated there, where they set up shop in what was a abandoned, according to one of these that I'm reading, because I've got a number of these Dead Sea Scroll books out where they're all giving me the history and the when they did the archaeology work, they're finding that it appears that compound was established over the top of a fortress with ruins, etc. But that this whole community came about and was set up somewhere around between, certainly 175, but probably closer to 160 or something, was this community set up and then continued through the time of Messiah up until it was destroyed when Rome came in and destroyed all of the Jewish wars, and they destroyed Jerusalem, but they also destroyed the Qumran area, and that would be the end of what we understand to be Bethabara, now Qumran. But the point of bringing all this up is the suggestion that when John the Baptist, when he grows up and is filled with the Spirit, and he goes to the deserts of Judea, out to the wilderness, he didn't just go to nowhere. He was in the Zadokite lineage, his mother for sure, and maybe his father even. But either way, they were in the Zadokite priesthood. It would only make sense that this is where he went, into this community where maybe they all ate locusts and wild honey. Um, but but it would make sense that that's where he went, where he had learned the priesthood through the priest and was part of this whole community that had the sacred writings and preserved the sacred writings and were producing some of their own writings, their commentaries, and some other things. Um, and some additional scrolls that we've become familiar with out of the Dead Sea Scrolls now, that he'd have been part of all of that. And being now where the legitimate priests were, that probably is also the place where Messiah came down. And rather than going to Jerusalem and being anointed in the temple for his ministry, he went to John the Baptist, John the Immerser, where he was immersing beyond the Yarden, which is what Bethabara is, beyond the Yarden, where they had baptismal set up in a compound, and the whole thing might have been set up. So it appears that this is where Messiah came for his immersion and his anointing. And all of this would be the legitimate Zadokite priesthood that he was affirming by coming to John, and that John would be part of that legitimate Zadokite priesthood and not part of the illegitimate priesthood that was sitting in the in the temple, being led by the Sadducees of the time, which will be another video because she addresses some of that too. I want to address a little bit of the Pharisees and Sadducees if I can get to that. But let me go ahead and take you then to this spot where Rachel is sharing. And so, gosh, there are a couple spots, and I'll get you to both of them, but it'll just cover what she says and who she believes, what she thinks of the idea of the Essenes as the occupants of that area versus what she believes to be my understanding of what she's saying is that it sure appears to be the sons of Zadokite to her. And also just a quick heads up that I'm going to play one excerpt that I believe is about 13 minutes long, and then I'm going to follow it up, and there might be a little delay. I'm going to follow it up with a second video that's a little shorter, like 6 minutes, and it will start with somebody asking a question that you may not be able to hear entirely. I left it in there just in case you could, because he's asking for her to clarify, whether or not she thinks they're Essenes or Zadokites. And I think they're also asking her to clarify whether she thinks all Zadokites were Sadducees or vice versa, which I think she did state that, and I would beg to differ with that. But anyway, stay tuned after the first one for the second one. Thank you.
Now at 175 BCE, when the priest of the house of Zadok had been deposed and disrobed, they left Jerusalem at a certain point and took with them their library. That was the only thing they were allowed to take, because you were not allowed to take anything of the temple materials or anything of the temple objects. They were sacred and they were not to be touched or living outside of the temple in any manner. The one thing which was not restricted according to any biblical law was the books in the temple library. We know from the father of Antiochus the Great, that he gave exemption for the authors of exemption for the scribes of the temple from a particular taxation. We know that there was a temple library and there was a temple there were temple scribes. Apparently, they took the temple library. There was no greater public library in Jerusalem. And what we had found in Qumran is first and foremost a huge library, which is composed of various things. But let's assume that the biblical scrolls, the huge number of like 270 biblical scrolls of the 23 books of the Bible, were found in Qumran, not as things that they had written there, basically things which had been in the temple library and were taken out. They continued to write all the various things that I talked about. And when I say that they were interested in holy time, in holy place, in holy ritual, in angel priestly common worship, in holy sacred memory, I would like to ask, what is the word that I had used most frequently? Priestly. It is priestly awareness. It is priestly memory. It is priestly interest. However, most of the scholars who have been working on Qumran suggested from the very beginning of the scholarship in the early 50s to associate it with the Essenes. The Essenes are not known in the Hebrew language. The Essenes are first introduced to us in the writings of Philo from Alexandria. He's talking on wonderful people, 4,000 of them, who are living all around the land of Israel, when the measure of goodness and or virtue had been spread all around. Well, I wish to know where exactly Philo was traveling, where he saw all these good virtues, because of what we know in the first century of the land of Israel, around the time of Jesus, around the time of the rabbis, around the time of the Pharisees. It was definitely not exactly virtuous, to say the least, but Philo said that 4,000 of them are living all around the land of Israel. Philo had written in the first half of the first century of the Common Era. The second testimony about the Essenes is Pliny. Pliny was a great historiographer, a great army military, a great writer. In his book, Natural History, he's telling us that he knew or he had heard or he had witnessed a group of very strange people, the strangest of all that he knows, who are living along the western coast of the seashore, and their name is Essenes. As I said, the word Essenes in any way is not known in the Hebrew language or in the Aramaic language, but Philo is telling us that they are living for thousands of generations, surprisingly, celibate life with no women and with no children. Philo says the same. They are monks, they are celibates. Now, the third witness, and I'm doing it very quickly because I know I have to conclude, but Philo is the first witness, Plinius is the second witness, and Josephus is the third witness. Josephus is telling us in a more elaborate way that among the Jews in the land of Israel, there was a group known as Essenes, which is extremely virtuous, which is illustrious in its manners, in its ideals, in its ideal life. They love the elderly, they care for the sick and for the poor. They don't allow children among their midst. Most of them don't have, very few of them may have wives, but most of them don't. They don't believe in women. Basically, they're celibates and monks. However, the one strange thing is that those extraordinary people, Philo claims that they are known from the days of Moses in his book Hypothetica, those extraordinary thousands of individuals who had lived for thousands of years, according to Pliny, and who are all around, according to Josephus, are not mentioned in the New Testament, written in the very same time that Pliny and Josephus are writing. They are not mentioned in the Mishnah. They are not mentioned in the Tosefta. They are not mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are mentioned only in Greek and Latin in Philo, Josephus, and Plinius. Now, it is easy to do the conjecture. Here we have description of people with no books, and here we have books with no authors, okay? So people did like that. Now, we heard about the Essenes from three important sources. However, there was not a single book, shred of a page, one sentence, which was ascribed to them or had been quoted by anyone from them, not to say any book or piece of paper that they themselves had written. However, we know that there was such a group, as I said, by three important witnesses. But no scriptures were available. On the other hand, between 1947 and 1956, 1,000 scriptures of unknown kind had been found out in Qumran, along the Dead Sea. No immediate authorship had been labeled to them, although all what one had to do is to open and read. However, it was very hard to open and read, because while they were found between 47 to 1956, they became available to the scholarly community at large only in the 90s, and only in the course of the 2000s. I won't go into all the disputes about it. I would just say they were unavailable. Only few could have read. Those who have read them said, but it is written, the priests of the house of Zadok and their allies in endless places. It is about temple. It's about the Zadokite priests. It's about biblical Israel. It's about sacrifices. It's about priests and angels. It's about the 12 children of Jacob. It's about the covenant of the Bible. Why should we append it to the Essenes, who are not associated in any way to a solar calendar, to temple, to priest, or to any belligerent nature? The scrolls include polemical writings, very, very belligerent, hateful, spiteful against people who live according to a different calendar, about people who are traitors of the covenant. None of that is even hinted in relation to the Essenes. However, history of scholarship was that at the first 2 decades of the scroll scholarship, Jewish scholars were not allowed, according to the Jordanian government that had the scrolls in Jerusalem from 1948, when East Jerusalem had become Jordanian territory, until 1967, when Jerusalem had been reunited or conquered or freed or liberated, depends on the way that you see it. However, Jerusalem, East and West are combined. And then Jewish scholars and Israeli scholars were allowed to read the scrolls for the first time, all those who were not available before 1967. However, in the many years that had passed from early 50s, where first scholarship was available, until the end of the 80s, which really scholarship went back into fruition, it was common that the authors were monks who were called Essenes, who were living celibate lives in a celibate place in the desert. Now, we don't know where the authors of the scrolls lived. We have no idea. This is a conjecture and assumption. We know where the scrolls were found, in caves. There is no way to live in those caves. Very few people could live in the air conditions, without air condition, of the desert next to the Dead Sea. Very few and very young and very strong can survive there. However, there was no real huge community of thousands of people there. However, because of the fact that only Catholic monks and Protestant priests were taking care on the scrolls from 1948 to 1967, and then there was quite a long time before they had become available. It had been stabilized and asserted that the Essenes are part of the scrolls, and the scrolls are part of the Essenes, while this is not really true, because the scrolls don't have the name Essenes in any way, while it has numerous times the priests of the house of Zadok, the children of Aaron, the associates of Moses. They have biblical Hebrew, they have biblical concept, but they were associated with the Essenes because the monks who were doing wonderful work, assembling the pieces of the scrolls in the Rockefeller Museum, envision the writers of the scrolls as ancient monks who were living celibate life. Now, we don't know anything like that. We are not told that the writers of the scrolls are celibates. They are talking on women, they're talking on children, they're talking on family life. There is no reason to assume that all the writers of the scrolls were monks. However, history of scholarship has its fashions and its beliefs and its cornerstones, and ever since it had been defined that the scrolls are primarily an Essene library, and the scrolls are reflections of monks and celibates' life, their biblical context, their priestly context, Jewish priestly context, their very ancient nature as primary documents from the ancient Judea, that had been pushed aside, and only their connections with the Essene of the first century 250 years later than the time that the scrolls and its disputes were happening. The scrolls were started to be written, those which are not biblical, after 175 BCE. To the days of Josephus, it's 250 years later. Why should we take Josephus' testimony on the Essenes to be appended immediately to the scrolls? The scrolls tell us very well what they are. They introduce themselves as the temple scroll, as the scroll of priestly watches, as sacrifices, as priestly liturgy, as angelic liturgy. They have nothing to do with the Essenes. They have everything to do with the history of the tribe of Levi, with the testament of Levi, the testament of his son Amram, the testament of his son Kehat, the testament of his grandson, and so on. It is saturated with priestly issues, priestly concerns, priestly language. But ever since it had been appended as Essenes, that was the corner that it had to be left. And anyone who dared to say, let us look again and see whether the overwhelming priestly concerns of holy time, holy place, holy ritual, and holy memory should be taken into consideration before the Essene theory should be taken as the only foremost consideration. That is usually accepted with great resentment. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would be happy to receive some questions. Yes, please.
I find your distinction
Between the what?
I find your differentiation between the scrolls and the EC Leviticus. What I don't understand, are you suggesting then that the house of Zadok, or did you just suggest Sadducees are then the authors of the scrolls? Is that, and do you have any independent textual knowledge of this house of Zadok, their literature?
Oh, well, what I suggest is only what is written in the scrolls. The scrolls mention time and again, the priests from the house of Zadok and their allies. 1,000 times. I mean, it is mentioned time and again. The priests of the house of Zadok and their allies. Now, I don't say, not at all, that only the Zadokite priest had written it. Of course not. Prophets were writing, poets were writing, people of different talents and inspiration and prophetic knowledge were certainly among the authors, as we know from the biblical library. However, what I say is that wherever there is any direct description of the people that should be addressed, the people who are defined as the priests of the house of Zadok and their allies, is always in the forefront. So when you look on the scroll of blessings, who should be blessed? First of all, the high priest from the house of Zadok. Second, who should be blessed? The priest from the house of Zadok and their allies. The third one is the president of Israel, or something like that. So they are always in the forefront. They are the leadership. They signify biblical Israel ideal priestly leadership. As I said, I don't know if it ever has been such the case, but we do know from the Bible that the only high priests that were serving were from the high priest of the house of Zadok. That is a well-known stuff. When Ezekiel is talking in the last chapters of his book, 40-48, on the future temple, he's talking on the high priest from the house of Zadok, those which are close to God and chosen by him. No other group is described in these words. So the people who had written the scrolls were very much interested in the priestly lore, in the priestly legends, in the priestly myths, in the temple worship. That was their backbone. That was their focus. That was their most intrinsic interest, and we should respect it. We shouldn't say the priestly nature of the scrolls doesn't matter. It matters because it is everywhere there. We shouldn't say that this is secondary. It's not secondary, it's primary. We can find evidence on holy time via calendar, on holy time and ritual via priestly watches, on holy ritual via temple sacrifices and stuff. in every page that you would open. So it is for them the only common denominator that you can say about the scrolls that have been found along the shores of the Dead Sea is that they were kept and authored and reserved and transmitted by people who believed in the ideal biblical Israel and in the complete responsibility of people who associate themselves with this conservative past, with the priestly house of Zadok, to continue to believe and to work on those ideas which have been completely pushed away to oblivion. In the day that United Nations had declared on the State of Israel in 1947, these scrolls were found in the very same day, as like a long shalom, a long greetings from ancient past. In the very same day where the United Nations had declared about the acknowledgement of a new state as the State of Israel, these scrolls were first introduced. So they were in oblivion for 2,000 years and more. They were unknown. They were certainly not the central part of Jewish memory. But I would like to respect the other memories, the alternative memory, the shreds of memory that were entered to oblivion, and yet we have recovered them by a miracle, by a chance. It's wonderful that they have been recovered. We should pay attention to the other memories, to the other mythologies, to the other point of interest and focus of devotion, which had informed the Jewish people of the 2 centuries before the Common Era and of the few decades of the first era. I believe that we should take a lesson from there. There was never one authoritative Jewish community. There was always splinters. There was always disputes. There was always disagreement. However, if you would ask, what is the one single thing that the Jews shared always? It was their capacity to read and write. They may use it for belligerent writing. They may use it for all kinds of fights. But they would always say, we have sacred writings. We have holy scriptures. We can read and we can recreate and we can comment and we can do exegesis and we can do law, but we can also do myths and mysticism. We are free people to write, although we were told by Rabbi Akiva that we should not read the external books. We had read them some way or another during the centuries. Many of them we were not familiar with. Now we are lucky to live in a century that they are easily available to anyone who is interested in ancient history and in the way that one can cross the waves and turmoils of historical destiny. We'll conclude here. Thank you very much.